Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we are going to talk about memory retrieval. So to get started, I'm going to show you an image that you have seen a couple of times already, and this is the Atkinson-Shiffrin memory model. It should look familiar. We have spent some time talking just about the memory process and how information goes from one memory system, the sensory memory, to the next, all the way to long-term memory. We had a lecture that talked about encoding, and that was how do we get information from our short-term memory into our long-term memory. And we also had a lecture about memory organization. So if we dive into long-term memory, what do those different types of memories look like? Today we're going to talk about memory retrieval, and you can see from this chart here, memory retrieval is the arrow of getting information from our long-term memory back into our short-term memory or our working memory so that we can use it when we need it. So that's what we're going to focus on today, is getting that information back out. Retrieval is just a fancy word for remembering. So this is going to be our lecture on how do we remember. Before we get into retrieval specifically, I think it is worth taking just a moment and talking a little bit about the biology of memory. So we now have these memories that are housed in our long-term memory. Well, what specifically is that? Like, what is a memory? Well, a memory can be boiled down to cells in our brain that are firing in a very specific pattern. Now, for this slide, I'm going to avoid some of the more technical terms about neurons and neurotransmission and what that looks like, because we haven't learned that yet, and that's in our next unit. So I'm going to keep this relatively basic, but will hopefully help you understand what a memory physically is in your brain. I want you to look at these two images and remind yourself of those games you used to play when you were a kid where you had to spot the difference between the two images, right? Well, if you look at these two images, there's two main differences between them. One difference are those orange dots, and you'll notice that from the left image to the right image, there's a bunch more dots on the one on the right. And the other big difference are these kind of rice-shaped purple ovals. And you'll notice that on the right image, there's a bunch more of those than there are on the left. Well, those orange dots are what we call neurotransmitters. And those purple ovals are what we call receptors. So the big difference between these two images is the image on the right has both more neurotransmitters and it has more receptors. Think of it this way. The neurotransmitters essentially is the message that is being sent from one cell to the next. And the receptors are going to be the part of the cell that's receiving the neurotransmitters, that's catching them. When we form a memory, what happens is one cell sends a message to another cell. When this message is being sent over and over and over again, just like when you are studying, when you're reading something over and over and over again, or maybe you're learning how to juggle for the very first time, and so you're practicing over and over and over again. When you're doing that, when you're repeating this, you're rehearsing this, what happens is the cells get really good at communicating, and they actually physically change. They start to release more of the neurotransmitters, and the neighboring cell, what we call a postsynaptic cell or a postsynaptic neuron, actually physically changes to get ready to accept all those neurotransmitters. So the process of the neurons or the cells changing, physically changing, is what we call long-term potentiation. Long-term potentiation is the biological explanation of memory. It's as neurons change their structure and their function to better communicate. Plasticity is a word that we use in psychology to talk about when cells and when the brain is adaptable. So I have their synaptic plasticity. We see here how what's called the synapse, the gap between the two neurons, we see how it is adaptable. We see how it changes from the first image on the left to the second image on the right. As these cells change and adapt physically, it creates what we call a memory trace. So your memory of who the first president was, your memory of how to juggle 3 balls in the air, those are memory traces. Those are series of millions of cells that fire in a very unique pattern in your brain. And when you recall that memory trace fires. Here's another way to think about it. Imagine yourself walking through an overgrown forest for the very first time. Well, the very first time you walk through that forest, it's going to take you a while. You're climbing over bushes and trying to get through branches and twigs. But if the next day you walk that exact same path, it's going to be a little bit easier. Some of those branches have been moved out of the way, some of those twigs have been broken, some of the bushes have been beaten down a little. And if you walk that same path day after day after day, the path will become wider and smoother and easier, and you'll be able to get through the forest much more efficiently. And that's like how a memory works. The very first time you try to learn something, it's difficult, it's hard, it takes a while. But the more you use it, the more you rehearse it, the more you try it, the more those cells fire. That memory trace is solidified, and it happens so much easier. So I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, shoot me an email and I'll try to be a little bit more specific for you. All right, so we have these memories. They're formed. They are in our long-term memory. How in the world do we get them out? How do we try to remember? Well, there are two different types of retrieval. We have what's called recall and recognition. And I'm going to try to differentiate these two in a pretty easy way. I think you'll pick it up quickly. The first type of retrieval, fancy word for remembering, is recall. And let me give you an example of what recall looks like. Who is the president of Russia? That's recall. I ask you a question and you just have to remember it. You are given very little to go off of. You have a prompt and you have to just find that memory somewhere in your brain without any type of what we call retrieval cue. And it can be difficult. Now, this guy's been in the news a lot, so maybe you are able to recall this quite easily. But for you students out there who are struggling a little bit, that you're not 100% sure the answer, let's see if we can get you there. Second question. Who is the president of Russia? Exact same question, but now you are given what we call retrieval cues. Now you are given some information, and rather than simply recall it out of thin air, you have to recognize it through a sea of competing information. So you look at this and you say, oh yeah, it's Putin, right? The second one is an example of recognition, and it uses retrieval cues. It should come as no surprise to you that recall fades faster than recognition. It doesn't necessarily mean recognition is any easier. It just means that those particular memories, that type of memory retrieval, will last longer if you are given retrieval cues. Okay, let's put it to the test here. Which one is correct? Oh no, I've got 12 pennies there. It's safe to say you've seen lots of pennies in your life, and yet this can be difficult. See, recognition is not necessarily any easier. Multiple choice isn't always easy. Sometimes lots of information looks correct, and this can lead to what we call recognition errors, where you might confuse what is familiar with what is correct. The right answer, if you're curious, is A. And this happens a lot with multiple choice questions, especially in AP. So you're reading a multiple choice question, you're looking at all the options. Lots of those options are going to look very familiar. You're going to say, I kind of remember talking about that in class. And you may accidentally select that one instead of the right answer. So we need to be careful with the specific type of retrieval that we call recognition, that we are able to appropriately find the right information in a sea of perhaps misleading information. So when we are encoding, when we're encoding information, what's fascinating is we are actually encoding lots of other information as well. So now it's time to get that information out. It's time to retrieve that information out of our long-term memory. Well, there are some specificities that we can use to hopefully help us. So I want to think about this a little bit, okay? You're trying to study your AP psychology. So you've got all this content in your short-term memory that you are trying to encode into your long-term memory. Well, you are also encoding some things that are happening within you, some things that are happening around you. For example, if right now when you're listening to this lecture, you are maybe lounging on your bed a little bit, you've got some music on, you've got some Doritos next to you, you've got your cell phone out. Well, not only are you encoding AP psychology, you're actually encoding all of those external things. And so when it comes time to retrieve AP psychology, you want to try to mimic the environment. You want to try to mimic what we call the context. You will be more likely to remember AP psychology if you match the encoding specificity of your context, because memories are what we call context dependent. You're more likely to remember AP Psych when you're lounging on your bed, Doritos out, phone out, because those are what we call these little clues, right? These little encoding cues that help you remember. The reality is, when you're being tested in AP Psych, we usually have you sitting at a desk, well-lit room. So you want to make sure that when you're encoding, you're going to try to match the environment of when you're retrieving. And not only are you encoding the external context, you are also encoding the internal state that you are in. So if while you are studying for AP Psych, you are all hyped up on caffeine and you're really excited, or perhaps a more realistic example is maybe while you're studying, you're pretty calm and relaxed. Well, when it comes time to retrieve that information, we want to make sure that you match the state that you are in, because memories are state dependent. If when you're trying to retrieve the information for AP Psych, you're really anxious and nervous, it'll be more difficult to remember that information. You encoded it when you were calm, you should try to retrieve it when you are calm, because memories are state dependent. So context dependent and state dependent is the idea that when you encode information, you also encode your external environment, that's context, and your internal experience, that's your state. And again, you want to try to match those when it comes time for retrieval. Now, students sometimes confuse state dependent with this other term I have on the screen here, mood congruent. I have this on the screen for no other reason than students usually confuse these, and I want to make sure that we can differentiate them. So, one more time, state dependent, if you encode psychology when you're calm, you should try to retrieve that information when you are calm. But the other thing to remember is that memories are often what we call mood congruent, meaning our memories are going to match our current mood. If you are pretty happy right now, then you will probably recall lots of other times when you're really happy. If you're in a great mood, it's unlikely you're going to be sitting there thinking about all of these times in your life when you have felt awful. But the other side of that is, when you're not in a great mood, we tend to think about all the other times that we were not in a great mood, because our memories will match our mood. We have what are called mood congruent memories. This happens to me all the time. When I get stressed, the only thing I think about are other things that are stressful, and it just snowballs, right? And you've maybe experienced something like that too. It's because our memories are often mood congruent. So make sure that you can differentiate between mood congruent and state dependent. They're certainly different. Okay, so we're pulling information out of our long-term memory. It's important to remember that our memory does not work like a video camera, where we can just hit rewind, hit play, and it is this perfect replica of the past. But instead, every time we pull information out of our long-term memory, we reconstruct it. We work with it. It's malleable. Maybe we forget some things. Maybe we add some things to it. Memories are constantly evolving. We call this memory construction. And one of the most famous people to study the idea of memory reconstruction was this woman that you see here. She's still alive. Her name is Elizabeth Loftus, and she's the leading researcher on memory and specifically things like eyewitness testimony. She's done some really cool studies. So, for example, Loftus had participants come into a room and they watched videos of car accidents. And then when they were done, they left, and then they were given a questionnaire. And the questionnaire asked them things like, how fast would you guess the cars were going when they hit each other? But then other participants were asked, how fast do you think the cars were going when they smashed into each other? Now, it should come as no surprise that the more aggressive or violent the terminology used, the faster the people would estimate the cars were traveling. That kind of makes sense. But this is what's really fascinating. Loftus was actually able to change people's memories of the event simply by the way she asked questions. Because she invited these participants back a couple weeks later and had them fill out a questionnaire about the accidents. And she would ask them questions such as, do you remember seeing glass all over the road? Do you remember seeing glass? Not how fast would you guess they were going, but do you have a memory of this? And sure enough, when people were trying to close their eyes and think about the car accident that they saw 2 weeks earlier, they were more likely to have a memory of seeing glass on the road if initially they were asked how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other. So it shows that our memories are changing and evolving, and we can manipulate them whether consciously or not. And think about the implications of eyewitness testimony. Think about how if you witness a robbery at Quick Trip, think about how a police officer might come up to you and say, hey, what happened when this person brutally attacked the store clerk? Whether consciously or not, they have just changed your memory of the event. It's why police officers and others are trained to ask kind of vague questions that don't lead to one particular answer or another, such as, tell me what you saw. Hopefully that eliminates some of those possible manipulations of our memory. Another thing that we have found is that memory is ingrained more efficiently and for longer periods of time when we have surges of adrenaline. And we call these flashbulb memories. I've got a flashbulb memory of 9/11. You all were likely not even born, or if you were, very, very young. But when our body has this surge of stress hormones and adrenaline, we sear in what is happening. You likely have flashbulb memories of a time in your life when you have this increased heart rate and you have this adrenaline that's pumping. Maybe it was a car accident that you were in or some other big event in your life. And the idea behind a flashbulb memory to remember is this. Although it may appear to be incredibly vivid and stick with you for the rest of your life, they may or may not be perfectly accurate. Because although the memory is encoded very quickly, it isn't necessarily going to be encoded incredibly accurately. So it's important to remember. All right, it's a fair amount of information for this lecture. Our next lecture is going to talk about when things go wrong. So we'll talk about different types of forgetting, why we forget, what that looks like. If you have any questions at all, don't hesitate to send me an email. Best of luck.